I wonder if I could ask Jimmy Perry, please, if he would come and talk to us.
I'm quite amazed that you've all turned up. I think it's absolutely marvellous. I'll tell you a little story that reminds me of this. Many years ago, when we were making Heidi High, we were in Boreham Wood, and Sue Pollard and I went to get some booze to have a little party after the recording. And we were pushing these bottles of booze round Safeways, and a woman came up and said, "Oh, Miss Pollard, please, can I say hello?" And Sue said, "Well, of course you can say hello, hello." She said, "I'm very honoured. I'm so honoured to say hello to you, Miss Pollard." And Sue said, "No, you're not. I'm more honoured to say hello to you than you're honoured to say hello to me." And the woman said, "Oh, no. I'm more honoured than you're honoured to say hello to me." And that's how I feel. Very honoured. Thank you very much. What can you say? I mean, I thought when I was asked to speak tonight, I thought, now what can I do that's different? I've been talking about Dad's Army for donkey's years, and just for a few minutes, I'd like to tell you things that didn't happen in Dad's Army, the ones that got away, the artists that were in the original and then they weren't in anymore. And if you saw the very first episode where they were all lining up and Arthur went down the line and he came to an actor who was dressed in a dinner jacket, and the actor said, "Are you going to be long?" And Arthur said, "Why?" He said, "Because I'm going on somewhere afterwards." And Arthur said, "I wouldn't want to interfere with your social arrangements, but the Germans will be here any minute." And that was all about, he did, and he had a golf club over his shoulder. Now, very sadly, when David and I did the next series, we didn't have that character anymore. Nothing to do with the actor, I'll tell you his name in a minute, who was splendid, but he was too much like Arnold Ridley, so we had to drop him. We didn't want to do it, and his name was John Ringham. And he must think, as I do, every time I watch Dad's Army, God, it went on for 9 years, and I only did the first episode. And that's how very strange our business is. It's all luck, or not. Another person who appeared but once and never even appeared in the first episode was a man named Gordon Peters, and he played the farmer. And in the first episode, he had to bring in all his hoses and lay them out on the floor. And then they couldn't move because they were passing the hoses over themselves. Quite a funny scene. And suddenly, the half-hour episode was going to run 40 minutes. And David and I had a little conversation, and we looked at each other and said, "Gordon Peters will have to go." Now this is are you going to tell him or am I? I must be truthful. I said, "You tell him, David, you're the producer." So Gordon Peters was not in that episode. He appeared in a few subsequent episodes, but not as a fireman, which is strange because other people now, I'll tell you another disappointment. I'm not really disappointed. I was going to play Private Walker, as you know. And I wrote the part for myself, and I wasn't allowed to do it. Now, before I get all bitter, I have no chip on my shoulder. I have no chip on my shoulder about it. But I did write it for myself. But with hindsight, now, years and years and years later, I'm rather glad David Croft and Michael Mills, because Michael Mills said to me, "Now look here." Now Michael Mills was then head of entertainment, and he'd been a naval officer in the war. And he always started everything he said with, "Now look here." And he had one of those voices you could hear on a force 10 gale on the poop deck. You can't be both sides of the camera. So I didn't become Walker. Now, I look back, I realise what a narrow escape I had, because Harold is so kind, talking about Arthur Lowe. Arthur was brilliant and quite a close friend of mine, but I can tell you this, he could be a miserable old sod sometimes. As they could all be. Because you've got to understand, the people, the actors in Dad's Army, when we did Dad's Army, were all at the end of their careers, almost. And then suddenly, something happened to lift them all up. But they were a tough bunch of pros. Having said that, they're magic, and always wear magic, because Clive Dunn said to me about 3 years ago, you remember that time at the Oval Cricket Ground, about 3 or 4 years ago? And I gave Clive a lift in the taxi, and Clive sat in the back of the taxi, said, you know, Jimmy, it's all been like a lovely fairy story. It's all been magic. And it has been magic, everyone. And I just think, what I think is magic, how you all pay money to come along here every year. But I do appreciate it. I'm not going to be on too long. Just a couple of little things. I made a note here, if I get it the right way out. I didn't get, oh yes, another person who just missed the boat. Corporal Jones was originally going to be played by Jack Haig. Very funny man, very funny artist, but at the last minute, he had to fulfill a contract in a children's series called Wacky Jackie. And then we thought, now who is going to play it? And believe it or not, it was mooted for David Jason, who was then a young boy. Because if you remember in Porridge, he played an old man. Then finally, we got down to Clive. And another thing, there were several conversations about who would play Captain Mannering. All sorts of people were mooted. John Pertwee, Thorley Waters, who said, I can't stand the audience out there. I can't stand performing with all people sitting out there watching me. Well, consider the man had been in the theatre for about 40 years. It was slightly strange. And I want to pay a tribute to David Croft, because it was his trust in me. The only person I cast in Dad's Army was Arthur Lowe. And I kept saying to David, let's have Arthur Lowe. And when I said it to Michael Mills, he said, Arthur Lowe, he said, we at the BBC, they were terrible. This is 1967, ladies and gentlemen. We don't know him. Well, of course he knew him. He doesn't work for us, does he? He's in that thing, Jubilee Road, isn't it? I said, no, Coronation Street. And so I said, look, David, I know Arthur can do this part. And then Arthur was in a play at Windsor called Baked Beans and Caviar. It was an Italian play. And I said, come and see this show, come and see the play. And it was dreadful. And Arthur was quite appalling in it. And it wasn't Arthur's fault in any way. It was just the bad casting. And there's another thing, you know, ladies and gentlemen. Being in the right time, at the right place, with the right part is so important. I always think there are many, many artists, men or women, who just miss the boat because they weren't there at the time. And they didn't go on to become famous. It's all luck in our game. Anyhow, finally, David cast Arthur Lowe, but the story doesn't end there, because we were rehearsing and Arthur was all over the place. He never learned his words. So David said to me at the 4th day of rehearsal, he said, I hope we haven't made a big mistake here, Jimmy. Come the recording, and Arthur was magic. He took off. That's when he took off, when we were recording, when we were doing the show. Another time, if you remember, there was a marvellous actor called Nigel Hawthorne. Now, Nigel Hawthorne and I were friends for many, many years. We both struggled, and and knew each other, and we were working with Joan Littlewood at Theatre Workshop. We shared a crummy dressing room in this drafty, cold, old theatre. And one November night, fog in the room, got to be about 50 people in the audience, the gas fire was leaking, and we were just sitting there looking at each other, and Nigel said to me, "Jimmy, I can't stand it any longer. I'm going back to South Africa. I've been working for 18 years and I can't even get arrested." Now this is the man who later became Sir Nigel Hawthorne, one of our great night actors. Anyhow, go fast forward a few years, and we'd done the first 2 series of Dad's Army, and I met Nigel Hawthorne outside the BBC. And I said, "How are you doing, Nigel?" He said, "Terrible, I'm really going to go back to South Africa. I've just done a broadcast, a few lines." He said, "I'm so glad Dad's Army's a success." He said, "You got anything in it for me?" And I said, I'll have a word with David." And I said to David, "Look, we've got a small part in one of the shows, this is in the desperate drive of Corporal Jones, of an angry man, where they're trying to get Mr. Blewett in the front of the van. And they can't get him quite in the front because they're pulling him and pushing him around. And along comes Nigel, as the angry man said, "Here, leave that old man alone. You can't do that to that poor old man." And Bill, you said, "Clear off." Now this was the great actor, and when we were doing it, we were filming in a street in Thetford, and we did that turnover take. That's all right, thank you. We did that take, and David Croft turned to me and said, "I don't think very much of your friend." And ladies and gentlemen, a few years later, as you know, the madness of George, King George, followed by a knighthood. And the most marvellous thing, the final tag of this story is, we were at a BBC party, and in came Nigel Hawthorne. I said, "Well, Nige, we made it, didn't we?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Where have you been?" He said, "Oh, I've just come back from India. I've been playing in the film Gandhi." So it just shows you should never give up in this business, although sometimes it gives you up, and it's very sad, the people who miss that chance. Now, I must do a little thing, because I'm trying to keep off all the stuff that I've been telling for years about Arthur and all of those. John Laurie was a very strange man and totally mad. Now, a great thing that David Croft had was that he always, oh, thanks very much, he always used to say to me, "Oh, Jimmy, we've got a small part here. You got any of your tired old water rats that like to play it?" Now, let me tell you what tired old water rats are, ladies and gentlemen. I belong to a marvellous organisation called the Grand Order of Water Rats. We're 113 years old, and we're composed of rather elderly comedians and some quite young ones. And David was so generous in casting old pros. Marvellous. He always said, "I'd like to help, that's the thing I do." Now, David Croft's mother was a very famous artist, Anne Croft, in the 20s and 30s and 40s. She was a famous musical comedy star. And one of her leading men was Patrick Waddington, who was a big movie star in the 30s, British movie star, and subsequently worked for Ivor Novello and was a singer and a big name. And David Croft said to me, "I've had this letter from Patrick Waddington. Can we fit him in?" And there was a part of a brigadier. Now, it was about a half a page. And all he had to do was to be on the phone, "Yes, yes, so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so," and that's all. Anyhow, David cast Patrick Waddington. Came the day of the rehearsal and the recording. Patrick Waddington, you remember this, was standing in front of a piece of scenery about 4 foot by 2 foot on 2 bits of wood. It didn't even go down to the floor. And Patrick Waddington came on in his uniform, marvellous looking man, and he stood there in the middle of the floor, and the rest of the platoon were lined up with John Laurie looking. And so David said, all right, we'll run the scene. And they handed Patrick Waddington a phone with a piece of flex on it, and a prop man was holding the flex just out of picture. And the big film star, the big leading man, who had had his name in lights for years, suddenly burst. He said, I can't stand this any longer. This is a travesty. One dirty phone. I'm standing in a piece of scenery that doesn't even reach the ground. I protest. And John Laurie said, oh, look at the great actor, the great film star. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Anyhow, can't go on all night. I could. Just one tiny one about John Laurie. When Jimmy Begg died, we had a man in a subsequent series. We didn't replace Jimmy Begg. David and I never replaced actors that died. So we had this character played by Telford Thomas, the Welshman. He was a war correspondent. He had an armband with W.C. written, US. And he got a lot of laughs. Believe me, ladies and gentlemen, a hell of a lot of laughs. And they did not like it, one little bit. So one day John Laurie said, oh James, he said, a word in your ear. Just want to ask you a question. Yon Welsh fella, is yon Welsh fella going to be in the next series? I said, I don't know, John. He said, well, get rid of it, it's too funny. Ladies and gentlemen, just a few little stories to remind you, and I hope we'll all be back here again next year. Although why I make it, I don't know. But thanks for coming, and please always remember, from tiny little acorns, or whatever they call it, big things grow. And that's how Dad's Army grew. And it's amazing that you're so keen and enthusiastic. I don't think any of us realised when it first started what was going to happen to it. Thank you, thank you, thank you.